let's move into an area that is fraught with difficulty. And that is, what did Judaism look like in the first century? What was essential Judaism? Can I put it this way? What was the Grudem all Jews were reading at the time of the New Testament? All right, what was the acknowledged systematic theology? And the problem is, there wasn't any. So what we have to do is we have to take a look at all of the literary material that's come down to us that we talked about previously, and look at it, and then take a look at, obviously, the first and foremost, the New Testament, then this Jewish religious literature, and then what the Gentiles said about the Jews in their literature. When they talked about the Jews, how do they categorize them? How do they describe them? And we put it all together and say, all right, now, we've already seen there were different parties. Sadducees, Pharisees, Essenes. Everyone was not on the same exact page religiously. That many scholars today say we need to talk about first century Judaisms, not first century Judaism. Well, in the same way that we can talk about, 21st century evangelicals. But that doesn't mean that every evangelical, in other words, there's not a 21st century evangelical that here is something that everyone believes in, but that's what we're always trying to find. All right, what are the essential beliefs? Well, what are those that seem to categorize every party? And so this is to the best of our scholarly ability today to come up with what one might say are the unifying beliefs of Second Temple Judaism. That no matter who you were, you would give assent to this or these basic truths. Well, the first is a no-brainer. Certainly within all of the New Testament, within all of the Jewish literature, and this was the predominant characteristic that was voiced by non-Jews, of first century Jews, no matter who they were, where they came from, was the fact that Jews were monotheistic. They believed in one God, as opposed to the Gentiles who believed in many gods. So, monotheism that was both creational, that is, one God has created the world, and providential, that one God is involved in the world that he has created. So if there is one unifying belief above all others, it was we worship the one true God. By the way, that's what attracted, first and foremost, many God-fearers to Judaism. The fact that they worshipped and followed one God. And that this had a tremendous witness to the religious confusion that was around at the time of the New Testament. Now, in one way or another, it was believed, because obviously these are all Israelites, that this one God had uniquely chosen Israel to be his people. I mean, even Caiaphas, Jesus has got to go, the nation's got to be saved. Now, he's saying that from a certain amount of self-interest, but it also flows out of an understanding that somehow there's something unique about our nation. And of course, for the Israelites, what was unique is that God had chosen them. And remember, even the Sadducees believed the Torah was God-given. That this one God who chose Israel had given Israel the way to live, the Torah, his wisdom, his direction. his guidance, his instruction. And again, even the Sadducees, it seems, had their scribes that devoted themselves to nothing else but trying to figure out, what does the law have to say? What does the Torah have to say in how we are to live? What are the laws? How do they apply specifically to our situation today? Now that seems to be implied. Obviously, once we get to the Pharisees, they were very, very well known for the fact that they were those who followed the law. That they wanted to make sure that both they and their followers, those who they taught, were law keepers. Now, one of the reasons that I think even with the New Testament, that I think it's implied that the Sadducees also followed the law in their own understanding, is the fact that at times Jesus Christ will talk about the righteousness of the Sadducees and Pharisees. And certainly it's picked up in Matthew chapter 3 when both the Pharisees and Sadducees come to John for baptism. And 3:7, you brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come? And this is lumping together the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Yet uniquely when it came to law keeping and meeting God's righteous standard through keeping the law, there was a particular emphasis as far as the Pharisees, Matthew 5:20 in the Sermon on the Mount. Unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, the experts in the Old Testament law, particularly those who follow the Pharisaic understanding, you shall not enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, why this is vital for the disciples is there was no group recognized by the multitude as being more righteous, understanding God's Torah and living by it, than the Pharisees. So when he says, if you don't have a righteousness that exceeds the Old Testament experts associated with the Pharisees, they would throw up their hands and say, that means we can't enter. You got to have a greater righteousness than that. Well, we'll come back and talk about that when we get to Matthew. But here we see that, all right, both Sadducees, Pharisees, and of course we'd assume Essenes also would view the Torah as we need to learn it and follow it. Their debate was on the interpretation of the law, not the importance of the law. Okay. By the way, I will say this about Paul, because Paul indicts all of Israel for seeking to follow the law and establish their own righteousness before God at the end of Romans 9, beginning of Romans 10. And you know what? I think Paul knew a whole lot more about Jewish thinking of that day than some 21st scholar in some university lecture hall somewhere in Western Europe. But I won't mention anybody by name. All right? And God's gift to Israel was the land focused upon the temple. Now, how far the Essenes would say that, and the Qumran community, they saw the temple of their day as being abominable. But they did believe that God ultimately was going to judge the temple, rebuild the temple. In other words, their hope was also built ultimately upon a temple, even though it wasn't the functioning temple of their day. And of course, they were also nationalists who believed in some way the land was God's gift to Israel as well. And then we get to the hope for the future. And once again, this is where it's hard to say, okay, every last Jewish party saw everything just exactly the same way, but broadly, there was an understanding that God had something better in the future that he had promised to Israel. And you got to realize that particularly in Palestine, you got probably 90% of the people living in abject poverty under what they thought the brutal rule of Rome. And you can see how in those kind of environments, where reflecting upon a hope that things are going to change, it's going to be better in the future, you know what kind of a pull that has upon people. So the writers do speak and do reflect upon what the Old Testament said about the future. And the writings did speak about the day is coming when Israel's going to be on top. Israel's going to be restored. And the Gentiles, and depending on who you write, are either going to be destroyed or subjugated or converted. And of course, the Old Testament seems to indicate all three. A purified temple. Sadducees, again, we don't have their literature. We don't know to what extent they believe the temple of their day was abominable, but certainly the records that have come down to us, the temple of that day was not the temple of the future, which would also include purified worship. And in some way, the coming of the Messiah, or at least the coming of a Messianic age, an ultimate utopia, and to what involvement a personal Messiah would have in that. Again, as you have different writings, they have more or less emphasis upon the individual. Even the New Testament, I'm going to argue, I think implicitly shows us that Israel's problem was they were more concerned about the kingdom than they were about the king. They were more concerned about their blessing than they were being right with God. They really wanted the kingdom without repentance. It's going to be a very key theme as we get into all of the Gospels. This again, and Paul's exegesis, true. They thought they could establish their own righteousness apart from repentance. Now the Gentiles didn't have that hang-up. They knew very clearly that they were alienated from God. I mean, if they believed in a creator God, if they started to hear the Old Testament, they knew they were on the outside looking in. They knew that they had no way to earn their way to God. In fact, that doesn't become a problem, for Gentiles until they got converted. And then the Judaizers started to say, now you got to live like a Jew. You got to earn your salvation just like we are. I mean, that's to simplify it way too far. But we'll talk about the Galatian heresy when we get to Galatians and other things. So, but again, this background helps us again to appreciate what the apostles had to deal with. Now we're talking about belief. Even among the Gentiles, the Jews were known more for what they did than what they thought, because that's what Gentiles saw. A lot of Gentiles didn't show up to the synagogue to find out what are they teaching. But as they interacted with the Jews, they certainly saw how they acted. And even outside of Judaism, by the first century, there was more of an emphasis, even in and among the Greco-Roman philosophers of their day, on ethics rather than epistemology and ontology. It's not so much what you think as how you act. The emphasis was upon behavior. And of course, this was a place where the Jews and very definitely, yes, that there was a distinction between Jew and Gentile, worshiping one God versus many gods, but there was another very important aspect of distinction, and that was circumcision. We've already said the Greeks and the Romans looked down upon it, and of course the Jews practice it. Now, this showed obviously because you're Jews of the dispersion, and even in Jerusalem and other areas within the land of Palestine where the Romans might be, you would have public baths, and so it was impossible for a Jew and that's the only way you could keep yourself clean in that day. So it was very, very hard to hide your circumcision from the other men of the community. So to what extent, a Jew was ashamed of his circumcision showed how much he was ashamed of being a Jew. So circumcision was viewed by both Jews and Gentiles as being a very distinguishing behavioral mark between the two. By the way, it's interesting when we get to the New Testament, at times Paul, particularly in Galatians, can use circumcision and uncircumcision as another way of speaking of Jews and Gentiles, Israel and the Gentiles. Israel, the circumcision, the Gentiles, the uncircumcision. So it shows how much this had come as far as the distinction by both Jew and Gentile alike. Also, the Jews kept the Sabbath. Roman writers even talk about the Jews being lazy. They take a day off a week. They do no work. Now, the Romans have their own laziness. The Roman mentality was get up as early as possible, get your work done so you can party for the rest of the day. So if you were wealthy, you were up, you got your business done, and if by noon you weren't on the banquet circuit, there's something wrong with you. So we could say that the Romans were not models of 24/7 workaholicism either. But they certainly, here you are conducting business with Jews, and all of a sudden it comes to Saturday morning and the Jews aren't there. So they were known as Sabbath keepers. And again, Sabbath was another distinguishing mark between Jews and Gentiles of that day. They also prayed twice a day. 9 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, no matter where they were. Once again, you're a Roman. You just started, the day. You're working with a Jew, and all of a sudden, 9 o'clock, he's where's he gone? Well, he's gone to pray. Huh? Now, by 3 o'clock, they weren't. The Romans didn't want to work at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but 9 o'clock. So again, I'm just trying to help you. If you're a Gentile with a Jew that you're working with, again, the Sabbath and the time of prayer would be, what's he doing? What's he up to? Known by practice. And then the feasts. According to Deuteronomy 16, and they were still honored by Palestinian Jews of Jesus' day, three feasts: unleavened bread, Feast of Weeks, Feast of Tabernacles, incumbent upon all Jewish men 20 and above to go to Jerusalem. Now, obviously, a diaspora Jew could not go to Jerusalem 3 times a year for the feasts. He would spend just about the whole year traveling. It was a good 2-month journey from Rome to Jerusalem. So, and you got to realize that the sea channels and most of the roads, because of the weather, were pretty inaccessible from the second week of November through to about the second week of March. You got 4 months. No one is traveling. No commerce is going. So you got 8 months out of 12. So you can start to figure out the logistics. So what had been dreamed up, we don't know by whom, but the incumbency upon dispersion Jews, that is males 20 and above, to spend at least 1 year in Jerusalem. Now what they would do is, because and many obviously had family, they traced back their ancestors, just like Paul lived, with a relative in Jerusalem when he studied with Gamaliel. But what they would do is they would get to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles, which was late September, early October, right around now. We're going to have tabernacles about the 5th, 6th week of the semester is when it usually works out. 4th, 5th week, 6 weeks, sometime in there. So you can take a look. As soon as you flip your calendar to September, see where tabernacles is. And they would get there, and that was viewed as the preeminent feast at the time of the New Testament. In fact, so much so that, for a Jew, there is no joy like being in Jerusalem for tabernacles. It was our Thanksgiving. It was a time of music, of dance, of merriment, of just rejoicing in God's goodness to Israel. So tabernacles, and then they would stay through to the Feast of Weeks, Pentecost, sometime in the middle to late May, and then they would leave Jerusalem and return back. Significantly, when you get to Acts chapter 2, sometimes when you read that, I think the immediate idea many have is, well, they just got there. And they really didn't. Because Luke tells us that they were dwelling in Jerusalem, not visiting Jerusalem. They were dwelling in Jerusalem. And so he speaks about that in 2:5. There were Jews living, dwelling in Jerusalem, devout men from every nation under heaven. Because not only were some there just to be there for an annual visit, but it was also particularly, if you had a family business and you pass it on to your son, numbers of diaspora Jews would go back to Jerusalem to live because that's where they wanted to die. Why they want to die in Jerusalem? When the resurrection comes, who's going to be raised first? Those in Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is the place to die. And if you had the wherewithal, you would try to make it not only one time for a feast, but you also try as a diaspora Jew to get to Jerusalem for your death as well. All right, now along with these practices, and as I said, the Jews can't keep any of this secret from the Romans or the Greeks. They live, there's so many dispersion Jews, and they're known by these behavior characteristics. Now we talked about the Messiah. And the question arises, what exactly was the Messianic hope at the time of the New Testament? You can certainly go to readings from the first century world, and you can have, as you can see there, approximately 25 pages of material from different Jewish sources that speaks about the Messiah and the Messianic age. You can see the discussion by F.F. Bruce. You can take a look at the article in the Dictionary of New Testament Backgrounds. But I've tried to boil it down into a chart. And here's the chart. The line, all right, that is history. Begins with creation. And of course, as far as the Jews, in association with the Old Testament, it goes on as far as they can see into the future. Now, above the line is what we've learned in the Old Testament. That Israel's hope is in what God is going to do at the end of the days. History is moving to a climax. And as you take a look, and I've put a number of significant passages, the first 4 from the Torah, and then Isaiah 2 and Hosea chapter 5. But particularly as you take a look at the Torah passages, the first 2, Genesis 49, Numbers 24, speak in terms of a coming king and a time of blessing. A time when Israel will be dominant over their enemies, when their ruler will rule to the very ends of the earth. But the end of days also, Deuteronomy 4 and Deuteronomy 31, is a time period that begins with Israel in distress. And being in distress, they will call out to God, who will deliver them. Putting the two together, the end of the days incorporates both the distress of Israel and then God's deliverance of Israel that brings their restoration and blessing. Now, as the teachers of Israel, the New Testament era, tried to put this together, they would speak in terms of this age and the age to come. And there's, some debate on exactly what the age to come was going to be, but the majority speak of the age to come as being this time of restoration. Some just see it as the age to come as some future bliss that God is going to bring. So much so that I don't think you can argue just on this age versus the age to come from Jewish literature on whether you have a basic, can I put it this way, pre-mill or a-mill understanding. Was it a literal rule bringing blessing upon the earth, or we're just looking at a time of general bliss that's going to come upon God's people in the future? And in what way was it tied into the Messianic age and the rule of the coming king in the kingdom of God? But more predominantly, I think this can be argued, that the more dominant understanding would fit more into what we would think today as being a restoration of the nation back to the land, Jerusalem being the center, a Messiah ruling, and that rule extending to the ends of the earth. Gentiles being converted, subjugated, and joining Israel in that worship in the age to come. With this age being known as the former age, in contrast to the world to come. Now, in the Old Testament, and also in the Jewish literature, reflected in Matthew chapter 3, when we get there, between this age and the age to come is this time of distress, which was predominantly known in the Jewish literature as the wrath to come. That the wrath to come precedes the age to come. The time of distress precedes the time of restoration. John 3, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come? Even Matthew chapter 7, the wise man built his house on the rock, that when the storms came, the house survived. All right, so before deliverance, before ultimate salvation, there is going to be this time period of distress, which before the world to come, this age would be the former age, and the wrath to come was also known as the latter age, the latter part of history, which will then transition into the world to come. Also known as the Messianic age, or the kingdom of God, the kingdom from God, and of course the kingdom that God rules. So the kingdom which was come from God, the kingdom where where God is the one who is the ruler. And to what extent a personal Messiah was involved in this, as I already said, was a matter of disagreement. That God is going to bring this about. Some emphasize the fact it's going to come from heaven. God's going to do it. He's going to step into history, bring history to an end. And more nebulous, that the nation will be restored. There will be a time of blessing and bliss. But there were others based particularly upon the interactions with Daniel 2 and Daniel 7 in the Jewish literature, the more apocalyptic literature that inferred and explicitly would state that God would send a Messiah, a king from heaven to do this. And certainly as we read the New Testament, we have to read the Gospels, and as we do, find that certainly among the multitude, there was a sense of someone coming. And that when this one came, then this age of blessing, this age of bliss would accompany it, would accompany him. So this gives us some idea where Israel's thinking was at the time just before the coming of the Messiah. All right, any questions? Any questions on Jewish belief, Jewish behavior, the Messianic hope at the time of the Gospels, the time of the New Testament?